Hey guys, and welcome back. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through a basic setup of using software RAID on our Linux machine. So what I'm first going to do is I'm going to add two new disks to my machine right now. So what I will do is I'll click my device, I'll go to settings, I will go to storage, and I already have a second disk, but I'll just add another. So I'll go down to here and click this little icon and then choose hard disk. Now I'll create a disk, I'll just say next, and I'll make the size pretty small. I'll just maybe make it around half a gig maybe. Let's create you. And I'll scroll down, select it and click choose. So now that has been added. What I'll now do is do the same thing once again, just add another. I'll create, again, just make one of the same size and I'll just choose this. Okay, perfect. So I'll say okay. And now I'll start my machine up with these two new disks added. Okay, so I have logged back into my machine. If I do an ls on my dev SD drives and I do wildcard, we can actually see we've added these two new devices, SDC and SDD, neither of which have been partitioned though. Now, one particular file location that we absolutely want to be remembering that we can use to verify that a RAID device has been created is by looking at the contents of the proc mdstat file. This file, mdstat, stands for multiple disks, so mdstat, multiple disk statistics. So if I say cat proc mdstat, notice here that right now we have no information here, meaning that we do not have any RAID devices. What I'm now going to do is I'm going to use fdisk to partition those new drives I just added. So what I'll do is I'll say sudo fdisk and the first device is going to be SDC. So I'll hit enter. I will say N to create a new partition. I will say P for a primary partition. Partition number will be 1 and I'll just hit enter for my default sectors. Now, one thing to note here is that it says here it's created one partition of type Linux. Now remember what we talked about in the previous nugget. There is actually a particular label we want to give this partition to denote it that it is a RAID partition. So if we want to change the type, what I can do is say T to change the type. And I want to list the actual hex codes, so I'll do capital L. And this will show me all my different codes. Now the one I want to do is this one right here, FD, which is a Linux RAID auto partition. This will give it that FD marking we were talking about. So now I will say FD, and it's now changing the partition type from a regular Linux that we would use for a regular partition to a Linux RAID auto detect partition. Now that I've done this, I will say W to write that information, and now that has been written to and saved. So we want to do the same thing, but we want to do it for SDD this time. So we'll do the same. We'll create a new partition, make it a primary partition. Number 1, default sectors. The type is going to be, as we can see here, Linux. We have to change that, so we'll say T. Again, check the codes. It's going to be FD. That has now been changed. We'll say W to write, and that has also been written to. Now, if we happen to cat our proc mdstat file, notice that nothing has actually changed quite just yet. We still have to use some particular commands to create these RAID partitions. Now, the command that we want to be using is one called mdadm. This is the multiple disks admin tool. So like I say right now, if I go into my dev directory and just list everything, we can see these new devices with new partitions, SDD1, SDC1, but notice there is not one called MD0 quite just yet. This is one we're actually going to create, and we'll do so using the mdadm command. So if I clear the screen and I say man mdadm, oh, we do not have this. This is because I have forgotten to install it. So I'll have to install mdadm. There we go. And I'll say yes. That will go through the installation. Okay, so let's try that man page one more time. Now it does appear. So we can see this tool here, this utility, is to manage Linux software RAID. And we can get our big description about all this information, but if we scroll on down, we can see the different options we have available to us. We can do the -C or -- create to create a new array. This is something we definitely want to be doing. Now, another important thing we want to specify here, we can also do -v or --verbose so that we can actually print out what is happening as the array is being created. A very, very important one is this one here, -l or --level. This is the option that we can use to specify the RAID level we want to invoke. So remember, in the previous nugget, we said we could have things like RAID 0 or RAID 1 or RAID 10, RAID 5. There actually are even more RAID levels, which we can see here. RAID 4, for example. But for the purposes of the examination, 0, 1, 5, and 10 are the main ones we want to focus on. So with this option, we can specify a particular array that we want to invoke. Let's say I want to invoke a mirrored array, so we have perfect redundancy, i.e. each disk has a carbon copy of the data. We can use RAID level 1, so that is what we will do right now. If I press Q here and I clear my screen, what I'll do is I'll say MD ADM. In fact, I will use my super user privileges. I'll say MD ADM, and I will say -- create, or I could do -C as we saw, and I'll say -- verbose, so we can see the output. And now what I want to do is I want to specify the name of the array, the partition that we want to create. So I'll say in dev, we'll have one called MD0, so multiple disk 0, 0 being the very first one we create. If we create another one, we could call it MD1, and then another one, MD2, so on and so forth. So we will say MD0, and now I want to specify the level that we want to create. We want RAID 1. And now what I have to specify are what devices am I going to use within this RAID array. So I will say RAID devices equals 2, because we have 2 disks that we want to use. And now I'm going to supply as an argument these different disks. So we had SDC1, which was the partition we just created for the new disk, as well as the other disk, which was SDD1. Both of these partitions, remember, have been marked with that FD label. So I will hit enter, I will say yes, hit enter again, and now the array has been created. So what I can do now is I can do ls in my dev directory. Notice now we have MD0 right here. Now what we can do here is treat this like a regular partition. So what we'll do is we'll use fdisk on dev MD0. I'll create a new partition. I'll make it a primary partition. I'll hit enter and enter and enter. The partition type, this one is interesting. This time, we're just going to leave it as the regular Linux, because ultimately it's just going to store regular Linux information. So that is why we're just going to leave that. If I hit W, this is now going to be written to. If I want to add a file system, we can do that with the commands we have saw before, mkfs. So I will say sudo mkfs. So I'll clear the screen. I'll say sudo mkfs ext4, and we'll do it on dev md0. I'll say yes, and now if I cat proc mdstat, we can see here we now actually have a RAID 1 array, and we can see what is actually active within this array. We have SDD1 and SDC1, the 2 partitions of the 2 different disks that we just added. Notice here we have this value UU. This denotes those physical disks, both of which are in the up state. If one of those were broken, we would actually see a dot here instead of the actual U. So right now we have an active RAID array. This is very, very good. Now, here is the deal. If we happen to reboot our system, this RAID device is going to exist, but it will not be active any longer. The reboot will effectively deactivate it. Now you can just use the mdadm command to manually activate the RAID device every time you have a new boot, because like I say, it will boot up in an inactive state. But what you can do is you can create a configuration file for mdadm. So what I'll do here is I'll say mdadm --detail --scan. Oh, and of course I need my super user privileges, so mdadm detail scan. And this information here, we want to populate this information into the mdadm configuration file. So what I will do here is I'll actually just take this output and I'll redirect it into etc mdadm.conf. Now try to remember that particular location. This is where we can store our configurations for mdadm related configs, because ultimately once we pipe in this information here that we're seeing into this configuration file, this is going to allow us to automatically enable the RAID device and activate it when it has been rebooted. So if I hit enter now, oh, and in fact, you know what, I should actually just change to my root, because I have to write into my etc directory. So I'll just change to the root user, and I'll just do that instead. So mdadm, that's a good little point to make aware of, and pipe it into etc mdadm.conf. So if I hit enter now and I go into this particular file, let me just use nano instead. This file is now populated with this information. And like I say, that will automatically activate and enable the RAID device even when you reboot it, as opposed to having to manually issue the command every time the system has a new reboot. So we can now survive reboots. What we now want to be able to do is we would want to be able to mount this particular drive. So if we want to be able to create a mount point, what we will do is we will make a directory. Let's just call it, I don't know, /RAID perhaps. If I go to the root directory, do an ls, we now have this RAID directory. Now, can you remember the location of the file that we use in order to have persistent mounting of our file systems? If you said the etc fstab file, that is absolutely correct. So that's the one we're going to modify. We'll go into etc fstab, and I'm just going to add this information right here. So what is the device I want to add? I want to add MD0. What is the location of the mount point? I will just say /RAID. What is the file system type? It will be ext4. The options, I'll just give it the defaults. I'll have the dump value at 0, and I'll make the pass value priority 3. So if I save this and exit out, I can now cat this. This has now been updated. I can use my mount-a command, which will mount everything that I have specified within the fstab file. So now if I happen to say mount and I grep for RAID, we can actually now see that this file system has been mounted, and it is indeed a RAID array. If I do an lsblk-f, we can also see this here. SDD, this is a Linux RAID member, as is SDC, also a Linux RAID member. We can see the label. Notice the UUID here is absolutely identical here, and absolutely identical down here. And we can see the mount point is at /RAID and /RAID. So really, we saw here with the mdadm command, we can easily create a RAID array. We also understand we can find information relating to our multiple disk statistics with respect to a RAID array in the proc directory with the mdstat command. This will show that we have an active RAID array. If we want our RAID array to be active after each reboot, we want to create a configuration file which can automate that process. And if we want our devices or our drives to be automatically mounted, we want to make an addition or an amendment to our etc fstab file. Okay, doke, so that is us for our introduction into our basic RAID configuration tools. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.